Imagine being captured in the middle of the night. Your village is burning. Armed men surround your home. Anyone who resists is killed. The rest are tied together and forced to march. Some will die before they ever reach the coast. Others will disappear across oceans, never to return. In this video, you will discover the full, often misunderstood story of the African slave trade, how it began, how it expanded across continents, and the uncomfortable truth about the roles played by both foreign powers and African societies themselves. Because what you have been told before is only part of the story. By the time the great slave trades began declining in the 19th century, tens of millions of Africans had been enslaved across multiple systems. The transatlantic slave trade alone forced about 12 million Africans onto ships bound for the Americas. Millions more were transported across the Sahara Desert and the Indian Ocean over many centuries. Families were torn apart, communities were destroyed, entire regions were reshaped by the loss of people. For generations, this history has often been told as a story driven entirely by Europeans. But the full story is more complicated. While millions of Africans were victims of slavery, some African rulers, merchants, and kingdoms also played significant roles in capturing and selling enslaved people. Understanding this does not excuse the brutality of slavery, but it helps explain how the system became so vast and lasted for so long. If you value deep, honest historical storytelling like this, consider subscribing or following this channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the history of slavery is often oversimplified? To understand how the system expanded, we have to go further back, because slavery in Africa did not begin with Europeans. It had existed in different forms for thousands of years. In ancient societies like Egypt, various forms of labor existed. This included enslaved people, particularly in households and state projects. Though not all large-scale labor was performed by slaves. North Africa and the Mediterranean world, cities like Carthage were involved in the trade of enslaved people. Further east, the kingdom of Aksum captured prisoners during wars and used them as labor. But slavery in Africa was not just local. For centuries, long-distance slave trades were already moving people across continents. One of the oldest was the trans-Saharan slave trade. Historians estimate that several millions of Africans were transported over more than 1,000 years in North Africa and the Middle East. Another major system operated across the Indian Ocean. Millions of Africans were taken to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. They worked as soldiers, servants, laborers, and domestic workers. By the time Europeans arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century, slavery was already embedded in parts of African society. Africa was also home to powerful and organized civilization. The Ghana Empire, which flourished between roughly the 3rd and 13th century, controlled major trans-Saharan trade routes. It used enslaved labor in its economy. Later, the Mali Empire rose to prominence. Its famous ruler Mansa Musa became known for his immense wealth. Much of it was tied to gold production and trade networks. Some of these systems relied on enslaved labor, particularly in agriculture and mining. Slavery also existed within households. Some enslaved individuals worked as domestic servants, artisans, or administrators. Most enslaved people were obtained through warfare. Captives from conflicts were often forced into servitude. Over time, slave ownership became a symbol of wealth and power in some societies. However, slavery in Africa was not one uniform system. In some regions, enslaved people could marry, own property, or even earn their freedom. In others, conditions were far harsher. Historical accounts suggest that in places like the Kingdom of Benin, enslaved individuals were sometimes used in ritual practices tied to royal ceremonies. This diversity shows that when Europeans arrived, they encountered established systems, not a system they created from nothing. In the 15th century, Portuguese traders arrived along the West African coast. At first, enslaved people were transported in relatively small numbers to Europe, but everything changed with the rise of plantations in the Americas. Crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton required enormous labor forces. European powers turned to Africa to meet that demand. Contrary to popular beliefs, Europeans rarely traveled far inland to capture people themselves. Instead, they relied heavily on African intermediaries. African rulers, merchants, and traders controlled the interior. They captured or purchased enslaved people and brought them to coastal trading posts. There, they exchanged for goods such as firearms, textiles, and metal tools. At the same time, West Africa was experiencing political fragmentation. The once powerful Mali Empire had weakened. Smaller states competed for power. These conflicts produced captives. Many of them were sold into slavery. Different African societies responded in different ways. The Kingdom of Congo established diplomatic relations with the Portugal in the late 15th century. Its ruler, King Afonso I, engaged in the slave trade, but he also attempted to regulate it. They insisted that only certain individuals, such as prisoners of war, should be enslaved. enslaved. Along the Gold Coast, Axan states relied heavily on enslaved labor. This was especially true in gold mining and agriculture. In some areas, enslaved people made up a significant portion of the population. Ethnic and political divisions played a major role. Many captives were taken from rival groups or neighboring communities. A shared continental identity did not exist in the way it might be imagined today. Still, resistance occurred. Some communities fought back against raids. Others attacked slave traders. Some societies reconsidered their involvement over time. One of the most well-known slave trading states was the Kingdom of Dahomey. Rising in the 18th century, Dahomey built a powerful military. It carried out frequent campaigns that produced captives. Many of these captives were sold to European traders. Others were forced into labor within the kingdom. Slavery became deeply integrated into Dahomey's economy, politics, and religious practices. Historical accounts describe ceremonies that included human sacrifice, often involving enslaved individuals. Even as European nations began abolishing the slave trade in the 19th century, Dahomey resisted. Its rulers argued that their economy depended on it. By the 19th century, global attitude towards slavery began to shift. Abolitionist movements grew across Europe and the Americas. Naval patrols attempt to stop slave ships. European powers increasingly enforce anti-slavery policies, often alongside expanding colonial control. Eventually, the transatlantic slave trade declined, but slavery itself did not disappear overnight. In many parts of Africa, domestic slavery continued for decades. Local elites still depended on it economically. Throughout this entire period, enslaved people resisted. They escaped, they rebelled, they survived. Their actions played a crucial role in bringing these systems to an end. Today, the history of slavery remains one of the most painful chapters in human history. Millions suffered, families were torn apart, entire societies were reshaped. But to truly understand this history, we must confront all of it, including the uncomfortable parts, because history is really simple. Now, what are the lessons from this video? First, history is rarely as simple as it is often presented. Systems like slavery were sustained by complex networks of power, profit, and cooperation across different groups. Second, economic incentives can normalize even the most inhumane systems. Slavery persisted for centuries not because it was justified, but because it was profitable. Third, division makes exploitation easier. Many victims were seen as outsiders or enemies. This made it easier for systems of slavery to grow. And finally, resistance matters because throughout this history, enslaved people did not simply accept their fate. They resisted, they fought, they survived, and their struggle helped bring slavery to an end. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame, but about understanding how such systems form so they can never rise again.